Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona. There you go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to share that I'll be sharing my time with the member for Vancouver East. And I want to start by reminding Canadians, Mr. Speaker, that the middle class in Canada was built on the union movement. It wasn't until we had a strong union movement that we developed a strong middle class. And there's been a number of studies over the years by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives or the Centre for Future Work and others that have shown that starting in about the 1980s, union density, which is just a fancy word for what percentage of workers belong to a union. So union density from the 1980s to now has gone down from 38% in 1981 to just 29% today. In 2022, that number is from. That's a Stats Canada number. And that number, according to these studies, in a way that, correlates with a decrease in the number of Canadians that belong to the Canadian middle class and with a decline in real wages for Canadian workers. So we see that belonging to a union has meant more powerful paychecks for Canadians, has meant more job stability in many cases, and has meant a stronger Canadian economy overall. And when we see less workers belonging to unions, we see more vulnerability for those workers, we see lower pay, and we see the consequences for the Canadian economy. Because when workers are well paid for the work that they do, and they have spending power in the local economy, that helps feed local businesses and it helps feed our economy and create strong conditions for business as well. That's just the lesson of Henry Ford, who was by no means a socialist, Mr. Speaker, but even he realized that if you don't pay workers well enough to be able to buy products in the economy, it's not long before your economy overall suffers, and that well-paid workers are the cornerstone of prosperity. So, how is it that the union movement has been able to win powerful paychecks for workers or to help them win those for themselves? Well, the cornerstone of the labor movement, at the end of the day, there are many components to the labor movement. There's many ways that they do advocacy. There's many ways that workers within the union movement advocate for themselves and for fellow workers. But all of that at the rock bottom is supported ultimately by the ability to strike. That means the ability to say, I'm not satisfied with the terms and conditions of work, whether that's pay, whether that's benefits, whether that's pension, whether that's workplace procedures, workplace safety and health, and I'm not going to go into work on those terms and conditions, and I want to be able to stand with people in my workplace who feel similarly and demand better, and ultimately, all of us in the workplace, if we're of the same mind, should be able to withhold our labor. So that right to strike is the most important principle that subtends all of the power and the influence that the union movement has had in order to improve the position of Canadian workers. And the most significant way that that can be undermined is when employers are allowed to hire replacement workers during a strike. People who come in, and while some workers are out on the picket line saying that they deserve better pay or who want to address workplace safety and health issues, have other workers come in the back door and perform their work and get paid egregiously, sometimes on better terms than the workers who were out on strike were paid before the strike began. And New Democrats have been arguing alongside the labor movement for decades now and have presented many times legislation that would end the practice of employers being allowed to bring in replacement workers. The Liberals will say this was a campaign commitment of theirs. If you go and look at their platform, it's not true. It was a commitment that they made to ban replacement workers when companies lock out their workers, essentially impose a strike. But it's only since the NDP used our power in this Parliament that the proposal is a comprehensive one that actually defends the right to strike instead of offering punishment to employers who would lock out. And what we need in order to vouchsafe the power of Canadian workers' paychecks and their right to strike is a ban of replacement workers in the context of a strike as well. So I'm very proud to be part of an NDP caucus who has delivered that, who has made sure that this legislation does the whole job and properly respects and protects Canadian workers' right to strike. It's the kind of legislation that we needed for almost 6 years when IBEW Local 213 was out on the picket line against Leadcore trying to secure a first contract. Almost 6 years, Mr. Speaker. Well, I can tell you, you don't end up with a 6-year labor dispute unless an employer is using replacement workers, because the business wraps up a lot sooner than 6 years if they're not using replacement workers. And what that means is that the business is forced to bargain. Now, I've watched in this House as Liberals and Conservatives voted together, as I say, the real coalition here in Ottawa, the Liberal Conservative coalition, voted to order workers back to work, to essentially take away their right to strike. We saw it with the Port of Montreal, we saw it with Canada Post workers, and notable have been the examples where the federal government has refused to say that they'll legislate workers back to work, because then we saw the company come to a deal. One of those instances was in 2019 with CN, and CN was asking for back to work legislation. The government departed from its usual tack and refused to promise back to work legislation. And very soon after the federal government clearly refused the idea of bringing in back to work legislation, we saw a resolution to the strike. Because then the company's strategy for bargaining couldn't use the federal government to get out of paying workers their fair share and to circumvent a real negotiation at the table. Likewise with replacement workers. If replacement workers are banned so that they can't be part of the bargaining strategy of a company, we will see more speedy resolution to labor disputes, and I believe ultimately less labor disputes. And in fact, there's some evidence for this from jurisdictions with anti-scab legislation. And so for those who say this is a travesty and it's going to prolong labor disputes, there's going to be more labor disputes, those are people who are speaking against the evidence and against well, frankly, just in ignorance of collective bargaining, how it works, and the ways that companies mobilize replacement workers in order to get out of having to bargain fairly at the table. And wow, have we heard just like a cornucopia of red herrings in this debate. We've heard Tories talk about replacement workers at battery plants that haven't even been built yet. Well, I share their concern about tax dollars being invested to create jobs for Canadians. Those are legitimate issues, but they don't have a place in a debate about anti-scab legislation, because they're using a new term that they're developing today for replacement worker to distract from the fact that they refuse to take a clear position on whether they support replacement workers coming in the back door while real current Canadian workers are out on strike bargaining for better pay and a better future. That's a red herring, and Canadian workers should not allow them to get away with being, I think, dishonest, frankly, about their position on anti-scab by trying to distract with this other conversation. An important conversation, but a different conversation nevertheless. And this is our time to have that conversation about replacement workers in the case of a strike. They want to talk about the NDP wagging the Liberal dog. Well, there's some truth to that on this point, for sure. As I said, the commitment that the Liberals made is not what they're moving ahead with. We've actually got a formula here that's going to protect workers' right to strike. I'm proud of that. They can go sing that from the mountaintop. We are also doing that. And we want workers to know that, yes, we have their back when they're out there on strike, like the Leadcore workers who needed legislation like this, frankly, Mr. Speaker. But I would remind Canadians, too, of Bill C-377 from the Parliament when the Conservative leader sat at the Cabinet table, and Bill C-525. Bills that would have made it much easier to decertify a union in the workplace, not with the touted 50% plus one majority they like to talk about when it's time to form a union, but with a 40% minority, they would have allowed unions to be decertified in a workplace. Not only that, but they would have required a bunch of sensitive financial information about individual union members to be published online, which would have put workers at a serious disadvantage in terms of their strike position, because it would have required unions to reveal the amount in their strike fund to employers so that they could plan to bring in replacement workers and wait out the strike fund, Mr. Speaker. So give me a break when they want to stand up here and say they're standing up for workers. We know that a strong union movement is integral to the powerful paychecks that Canadian middle-class workers have been able to bring home. We know that banning replacement workers is important to protect that. It's why we're proud we have this legislation before the House.
Questions and comments?